Deep Sea Embers 426 to 430. In the deepest reaches of the corridor, faint murmurs resonated like ghostly whispers that one couldn't quite understand. It sounded as if the wind was softly sighing, hushed voices were discussing secret matters, there were constant footsteps like a restless soul pacing back and forth, and occasionally, the sharp sound of gunfire would pierce the quietude. These sounds blended into one another, losing their individuality. It felt as though everything was merging into a singular existence, without the conventional sense of direction, devoid of time or space. The corridor itself was reminiscent of this feeling, shrouded in a thick fog, ready to swallow anything or anyone brave enough to walk through it. An old man, his back hunched from the weight of many years, moved with caution through this winding, maze-like corridor. In his grip, he held a heavy wrench which would occasionally knock against the many pipes that decorated the walls of this underground pathway. Who was this old soul? Why was he in such a place? Where was he headed and for what reason? There had been an attack. At the stroke of midnight, the Queen's Guard had been mobilized. But the question remained, what or who were they attacking? And where was the battlefield? Random snippets of memories and fleeting thoughts would occasionally emerge in the old man's clouded mind, only to disappear just as quickly. Sometimes, he felt as though he was caught between two realities, his muddled senses and memories tangling up inside of him. At other moments, he felt he had been stuck in one spot, waiting for an instruction for decades. Looking down, the old man noticed his wrench had knocked against something. It was a helmet, jet black with a slim brim, bearing the emblem of the Queen's Guard. It was a piece of history, not commonly seen anymore. He stared blankly as the helmet tumbled and eventually rolled into a nearby drainage. Out of the corner of his eye, he thought he saw a shadowy figure try to emerge from the drain, but it faded into the encompassing darkness just as quickly. With his mind awash in confusion, he trudged onwards, the environment around him seeming more and more like a thick, engulfing tar. It felt like an eternity, but he finally reached the end of this mysterious corridor. Here, a chaotic scene awaited him. A mess of pipes, debris from a collapse, and an eerie smoke rising from the ruins blocked his way. He looked around, trying to make sense of where he was. He was certain he had never come across such a place on his usual routes in the sewer, yet he felt he was meant to be here for some purpose. He glanced down, catching his reflection in a small pool of water next to the debris. His eyes, filled with confusion and uncertainty, stared back at him. What was he supposed to do here? Suddenly, the pool of water displayed an eerie scene before him. Soldiers from the Queen's Guard battled the monstrous beings of the corridor. With their weapons, they managed to turn these ghastly creatures into cold, lifeless mud. The very walls, which seemed to seep with a mucky substance, became dry wherever these soldiers went, and the once consuming darkness began to wane, giving way to a clearer path. Everything happened exactly as Lawrence had anticipated. The mere presence of the Queen's Guard was suppressing the strange corruption, afflicting the mirror reflection of the city-state. If one were to describe the events taking place in this mirrored city-state, it would be as a monumental battle between two great powers. On one side were the mud monsters, and on the other, the Queen's Guard. Their intense struggle and intertwined destinies might have persisted for a good 50 years. Guided by Lawrence, his naval squad quickly moved through the intricate corridors, following the path previously cleared by the ghostly Queen's Guard. What used to be a long, hours-long trek was now significantly shortened to mere minutes. Throughout this speedy expedition, Lawrence was deeply introspective and observant. He tried to decipher the mysteries surrounding the Queen's Guard and hoped to somehow establish a rapport with these ghostly warriors. However, all his attempts were in vain. It was as if the Queen's Guard didn't even notice Lawrence and his squad. These spectral soldiers seemed more like remnants of a bygone era, endlessly replaying a historical battle. They marched, shot their weapons, engaged the enemy, and were defeated, all in a loop that might have been ongoing for countless years. Martha's information about the Queen's Guard was spot on, but it wasn't the whole story. Trying to work in tandem with these ghostly allies was a riddle that continued to elude Lawrence. Captain, they don't seem to notice or acknowledge us. What should we do? One of the sailors approached Lawrence, stating his apprehension. Following them like this, aren't we just dead weight? Lawrence's face was a mix of frustration and determination. His eyes involuntarily drifted to a small mirror pinned to his uniform. Before he could gather his thoughts, Martha's voice emerged from the mirror. I'm in the dark as much as you are about this situation. I knew they existed, but I never found a way to communicate with them. Behind her voice, faint sounds of gunshots emanated from the mirror, indicating that Martha too was in the midst of her own challenges, possibly as intricate as the ones down in the sewers. Have the Queen's Guard been replaying this same battle over and over for years? Lawrence pondered aloud. Is the outcome always the same every time? Yes, it always ends the same way. They start their assault at midnight, only to pull back an hour later. Every time, they're halted at the last hurdle. They couldn't overcome the final barrier. With this newfound knowledge, Lawrence instinctively looked in the direction where the ghostly soldiers were heading. They were moving towards the far end of the corridor. In that dark, tumultuous area, a palpable and malevolent force seemed to loom, feeling as suffocating and thick as molten tar. Lawrence suddenly exclaimed, I've pieced it together. From the mirror, Martha's inquisitive voice rang out, what have you understood? But Lawrence couldn't indulge Martha's curiosity from the mirror. Having realized his crucial role in this unfolding saga, he swiftly marshaled his men and hastened his advance. Simultaneously, the tumult within the corridor reached a fevered pitch. The Queen's Guard was gearing up for their ultimate onslaught. The spectral warriors, made of the very essence of shadows, roared into battle, their weapons wreaking havoc upon the abominations obstructing their path. As soldiers disintegrated into fleeting ghostly trails, monsters were obliterated, melting into muck that then seeped away. As this epic clash continued, all combatants inexorably gravitated to the corridor's end. At last, Lawrence was confronted with the climax of this intense conflict and the daunting barrier that had thwarted the Queen's Guard for decades. Before them stood a colossal door, ensnared by a complex web of thorny brambles and smeared with loathsome, dark mud. Its menacing aura was akin to a tangible nightmare, sending a chill down one's spine. The door itself appeared to have been carved and marked by gnarly thorns, eerily reminiscent of a twisted crown fashioned from twisted tree branches. Deep within this mesh of thorns, faint lights writhed and fluttered, akin to a myriad of watchful eyes concealed within a dense jungle. A mere glance could overwhelm a soul with overwhelming dread and madness. Even Lawrence, fortified with the power of the spirit fire, was momentarily taken aback by this foreboding sight. Doubts and anxieties raced through his mind. This, then, was the goal of the Queen's Guard. Directly in front of this menacing entrance, a thick sludge of black mud was agitating, giving rise to a veritable horde of ghastly beings. These grotesqueries appeared to be distorted versions of humans, bearing vague resemblances to city guards, naval officers, pirates, weapon-wielding civilians, and even surreal, monstrous amalgamations of ancient cannons and skeletal debris. These twisted entities, protected by makeshift defenses set up within the hall, zealously guarded the vine-entwined door as if it was a sacred relic. The ultimate battle was underway. With unparalleled vigor, the Queen's Guard unleashed their full arsenal upon the monstrous guardians positioned at the corridor's end. This retaliation reverberated through the entire second waterway. In the ensuing chaos, both sides suffered immense casualties, reducing their numbers by more than half. Lawrence and his few accompanying sailors were forced to take cover at the outskirts of this apocalyptic scene. Despite being shielded by the spirit fire, Lawrence couldn't confidently assert that he'd emerge untouched from this battlefield. But he wasn't merely hiding away. He was scrutinizing, keenly evaluating the Queen's Guard as they contended fiercely in this existential confrontation. As the battle raged and the forces on both sides dwindled, the defenses fronting the door began to waver. Those formidable cannons and demonic creatures were reduced to debris, and chinks began to appear in the vanguard of the thorns. Blasting team. Proceed. Hidden adjacent to the Queen's Guard's position, Lawrence suddenly registered a voice. It was the commanding tone of a guard leader. The next moment, he spotted movement at the periphery of his vision. A small team had detached from the main group and slipped into the drainage channels at the hall's edges, effectively out of the monsters' line of sight. They stealthily navigated towards a concealed area, flanking the thorny door. Simultaneously, the front line's firepower escalated as a hail of projectiles rained down, aiming to subdue and distract the monsters guarding the door. Lawrence couldn't help but hold his breath. Even though he was aware that what he was witnessing might be an illusion unaffected by external factors, his body responded instinctively. His worst suspicions were quickly confirmed. The team responsible for setting off the explosives, who were trying to approach the vine-covered door along the battlefield's edge, were spotted. Metal projectiles rained down into the drainage channel, and in a heartbeat, the soldiers equipped with explosives were consumed in a fiery blast. Almost simultaneously, another explosives team made their way into the shadowy trench on the opposite side of the hall, attempting to covertly approach the door that was bound by thorns. But their efforts were in vain. They too were detected, and the second team met their doom just a short distance away from the vine-laden entrance. In the midst of this chaos, a sailor's soft whisper reached Lawrence's ears, "They're disappearing." Snapping his head up, Lawrence watched in shock as the scene in the corridor unfolded. The Queen's Guard was dissipating. After the disheartening failure of the second explosive team, the Queen's Guard came to an abrupt halt. Their ghostly silhouettes began to wane, becoming increasingly transparent. Within moments, about a third of them had almost faded completely, resembling faint specters. Martha's voice from earlier echoed in Lawrence's mind. They never managed to breach the final barrier. The weight of this revelation hit Lawrence hard. He finally grasped the depth of Martha's words and understood the inevitable outcome of this repeated clash. The Queen's Guard were doomed to fail. Regardless of their tireless efforts and the number of times they relived this battle, the stark reality was that they could never surmount this last stand in their critical mission. This campaign had met its tragic end 50 years ago. Each subsequent replay was merely a mournful reminder of that fateful defeat. Lawrence felt a pang of despair, but a sudden movement caught the corner of his eye, snapping him out of his thoughts. Another figure was entering the battlefield from a remote corner of the hall. Like the rest of his crew, Lawrence found himself transfixed by this mysterious apparition. He was clearly no soldier. Instead, he was a young man who bore the unmistakable look of an engineer that might have been assigned to the military. His attire was a dark blue, rugged work uniform complemented by a softly angled hat on his head, evoking a fashion style that had been in vogue half a century ago. The young man swiftly moved towards the trench, a hefty wrench and a pistol hanging securely from his belt, eyeing the explosives left behind by the second demolition team. Gripping the wooden box teeming with explosives, he made a frantic dash towards the imposing door ensnared by thorns. For a fleeting moment, Lawrence found himself entranced, hopeful that the young man would achieve what others couldn't. But that hope was shattered when a bullet pierced the air, directly hitting the young engineer's shoulder. His body recoiled from the impact, convulsing in pain, and fell agonizingly close to his destination, just a few steps away from the vine-entwined entrance. The entire hall seemed to fall under a spell of silence, its vastness echoing the profound tragedy of the Queen's Guard's final charge. This might have been the conclusion of a sequence that had been replaying itself for decades. The sight of the young engineer, lying defeated on the ground, left Lawrence utterly speechless. This man represented the final hope of the Queen's Guard, the last beacon in their cyclic struggle, his fall emblematic of the climactic point of this ceaseless battle. Then, a rush of adrenaline brought Lawrence back to the present. Emerging from his hiding spot, Lawrence charged forth. The sailors watched in disbelief as their captain dashed with an urgency they had never witnessed before, making his way to the fallen young man. The once silent hall was now rife with commotion. The remaining monsters, previously dormant, sprang to life, bellowing and unleashing their weaponry, which reverberated deafeningly. "Protect the captain!" The crew's shouting voice pierced the mayhem. Yet Lawrence seemed impervious to all around him. His focus was singular, to reach the explosives. Despite being hit several times, his determination overrode his sense of pain. Crossing the vast hall, he dived into the trench, making a desperate lunge for the explosives. But as he reached out, his hand phased right through the wooden crate. Stumbling clumsily, Lawrence looked on, utterly dumbfounded. The explosives, undisturbed for 5 long decades, remained unaffected by Lawrence's tardy efforts to ignite them, serving as a poignant reminder of the futility of this timeless battle. Just like the ethereal Queen's Guard that surrounded him, the box of explosives was but a mirage, untouched by his frantic attempts. The air was thick with the stench of gunpowder as bullets tore through it, narrowly missing their mark. With every shot, the ground heaved, sending fragments of earth flying. The guttural growls of the mud monsters grew louder, sounding like a death ring, and some had already made their way into the trench, their menacing eyes hinting at a desire to tear Lawrence limb from limb. However, Lawrence stood immobile, his eyes transfixed on the spectral box of explosives. A myriad of emotions swirled within him, a mix of bewilderment, irony, and a sense that some unseen force was taking perverse pleasure in his predicament. Then, a barely perceptible movement on his periphery snapped him back to the present. He looked on, astonishment clouding his face, as the previously downed young man began to show signs of life. The man, still gripping the large wrench by his side, shivered uncontrollably. He managed to lift his head, eyes wide, staring directly into Lawrence's. There was an ethereal glow around Lawrence, an eerie green flame that seemed to mesmerize the young man. In sheer amazement, Lawrence stammered, Can you see me? However, the young man seemed to be in a trance. His lips moved rapidly, and after straining to listen, Lawrence caught snippets of his mutterings. I've encountered them before, those flames, yes, I've seen them, over and over again. Flames. What are you talking about? Lawrence's confusion was evident, his voice edged with desperation. Yet, the young man paid him no heed. With great effort, he began to rise, blood staining his attire. Stumbling, he made his way towards the formidable door engulfed in thorns, all the while murmuring something Lawrence couldn't quite grasp. Amidst his garbled words, Lawrence could discern certain names. Nemo, Admiral Tyrion, Crow. Despite his apparent injuries, the young man persevered. However, his determined journey was cut short. From across the battlefield, a volley of gunfire rang out. The young man's body jerked violently before he fell again. Yet, in an almost mystical sequence, another being, an aged, hunched figure, emerged seemingly from the fallen man's shadow. The scene seemed surreal to Lawrence. He observed the exact point where this elderly individual had risen, straight from a pool of blood that mirrored the young soldier. I've finally arrived. With trembling hands, the old man reached out to grasp the explosive device, a joyful grin painted across his wrinkled face. I've done it. His proclamation resonated through the hall, and his laughter was a striking contrast to the bleak surroundings. Clutching the explosive box tightly, he struck a match and set the fuse alight. With an exuberance that defied his age, he charged headlong towards the ominous doorway, repeatedly shouting, I've made it through. Engineer Wilson here. Engineer Wilson reporting back. I've survived. Boom. The deafening explosion sent shockwaves rippling through the cavernous hall, and its echo was felt in every nook and cranny of the surrounding corridors. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. In a gruesome act, a sharp and wicked spike brutally pierced the skin, adding another painful, senseless injury to a body that was already severely beaten and bruised. The eerie whispering and animalistic howls that filled the surroundings suddenly surged in volume as if the horrifying swarm of beasts was exulting in their successful strike. Their macabre merriment rang out like a discordant symphony of victory. Agatha raised her arm in defense, using her staff as a barrier against the harrowing figure, a monstrous creature that was more akin to a bone spike than any recognizable human form. A startling, splintering sound echoed by her ear. Caught off guard by the noise, it took her a moment to realize it was the final breath of her trusty staff. It had finally succumbed to a terminal break, irreparable and definite. Her faithful companion through numerous combats had met its doom. Against an invincible enemy, it had persisted until it could no longer resist its impending destruction. Well fought, gatekeeper, sneered a hateful, conceited voice once more. A ready sacrifice enhances the ritual, but overexertion risks ruining the dish. With the fragments of her shattered staff still clutched in her hand, Agatha gradually lifted her eyes. Dried blood had crusted around her eye, limiting her sight to a narrow, bloodshot view. Yet, through this restricted vision, she was able to take in the entirety of the grim spectacle unfolding before her. The chilling shadow realm had receded, revealing the central area of the sewer system that had been grotesquely remodeled into an arena of sacrifice. The walls and entrances were defaced with grimy symbols and signs of corruption. Suspended from above were sharp, stalactite-like formations and withered branches that threatened ominously, while the floor beneath had morphed into a sprawling pool. Where once there had been solid ground, there now gaped a wide chasm, hollowed out to accommodate a substance as black as the blackest night. The tarry mire seemed to possess a repugnant life of its own, emitting waves of sickening, squelching sounds. The hall was swarming with disciples of the harrowing figure, each one accompanied by their own shadow demon. They huddled around the black pool in the center of the hall like nauseating insects flocking to a rotting carcass, chanting unholy prayers and growling wildly. In response to their chaotic invocations, the black pool stirred, its movements becoming increasingly vigorous. This was their sacrificial site. They impatiently anticipated their final tribute, the sacrifice these deranged individuals revered, the gatekeeper of frost. They had already created a counterfeit of another gatekeeper, who was being directed towards a similar gruesome fate. Your supposed acts of free will are nothing more than steps leading you towards a preordained outcome. Don't you find this grand scheme artistic? Emerging from the epicenter of the black tar pit, a blond man stretched out his arms towards Agatha. His face possessed a remnant of attractiveness, but his lower half had morphed into a monstrous, writhing mass. At this moment, he resembled a grotesque, tentacle beast, a vile mutation birthed from the tar pit, grotesquely mimicking a human form. Very well, the time has arrived. You've grown acquainted with your surroundings. Proceed now, the hour for the sacrifice is upon us. At the brink of the tar-like pool, a structure akin to a tentacle slowly started to rise. As it emerged from the muck, its tip began to harden and gradually took on the form of a dagger. The sacrificial tool, a sinister herald of imminent disaster, edged ominously closer to Agatha. However, Agatha maintained an air of tranquil determination, whispering to herself, just a little longer, right there. Her hand ascended slowly towards her chest. But suddenly, her movements were harshly halted. With a jolt, she found herself disconnected from her own body, her ability to control her movements completely severed. I see your intentions, your attempts to sabotage, to derail our plans, the voice of the blond man echoed from a distant corner of the room. Struggling to lift her head, she saw his form looming at the periphery of her hazy vision. Unfortunately, to ensure there is no disturbance during the sacrifice, we've taken precautions from the outset, didn't you realize? Your journey through this duplicate city, your relentless slaughter of infinite decoys, even various incarnations of myself, all were meticulously planned to tether you tighter to this place. Do you feel your awareness of this sanctuary sharpening? That heretical scent grows stronger. Did you never question why? The reality, dear lady, is that the moment you entered here, you had already become an unwitting member of our ranks. With all her strength, Agatha managed to raise her head. The lethal spike hovered perilously close to her heart while her body lay paralyzed. Now, the puzzling discomfort she'd felt during her journey, the motive behind the seemingly pointless war of attrition instigated by the cultists, everything fell into place. It was all an insidious plot to taint her. The very next moment, the malevolent spike drove mercilessly into her heart. At the heart of the mud pit, the blond cultist threw his arms towards the sky. As the gatekeeper's heart was pierced, he reveled in the horrific display, crying out in ecstasy, "The offering is made. The life force of the saint kindles the dawn of our Lord's rise. Praise the name of the Nether Lord, herald the day of prophecy." Every cultist in the hall echoed his proclamation. Those fused with demons, monstrous and grotesque, spiraled into a wild frenzy, bellowing the name of their enigmatic lord. Some brandished blades, slashing their own flesh to feed the insatiable black mud at the center of the hall with their blood. Even the demons among them succumbed to the fervor, releasing a cacophony of mad, discordant shrieks. However, in the midst of this tumult of fervent cries, the black material in the mud pit underwent a brief yet violent upheaval before subsiding into an eerie stillness. The blond cultist, entrenched in the center of the pond, was jolted abruptly from his ecstatic trance. His mounting alarm clearly visible, he scrutinized the now tranquil pool, his eyes shooting towards the spike embedded in the saint's heart, and finally landing on the battle-weary and pale gatekeeper positioned at the edge of the sacrificial platform. "You're void of life." The fanatic's composure fragmented, pointing at Agatha in stunned disbelief. Why are you a walking shell?" Agatha returned his stare with unyielding resolve. And in that instant, a gentle smile finally graced her visage. "Do you honestly think, as a gatekeeper, I would disregard the sinister transformations occurring within my own being?" Agatha retorted, slowly lifting her arm. As the grip of the sacrificial ritual weakened, she could feel the control over her body tentatively returning to her. When I followed your misleading path to this profane gathering and discerned the malignant potential of this bloodthirsty ceremony, I initiated my own countermeasures. Agatha's hand moved serenely towards the spike lodged within her heart. As her fingers wrapped around it, tendrils of emerald flame started to weave an entrancing dance between them, infusing the invasive spike. Her eyes rose, her gaze unwavering and resolute, fixed on the cultist wallowing in the sludge pool. Every unholy ritual depends on the vitality of life's essence. I've drained mine. Do you comprehend the repercussions of your actions? The fanatic, eyes wide in disbelief, pointed shakily towards Agatha. You have. Rest assured, it's merely a minor setback, Agatha retorted, her head shaking almost imperceptibly, her smile persisting. The flames radiating from her grasp began to intensify. As long as I could kindle the flame. What are you implying? As the cultist stewing in the sludge pool attempted to counter, his voice was abruptly drowned by another seismic roar originating from the remote corners of the assembly hall. The deafening rumble instantaneously shattered the remaining bonds of the sacrificial ritual. A colossal portal, deeply anchored within the congregation and the towering wall it was affixed to, was obliterated by powerful explosives. Boom! Shards of stone and concrete were hurled through the air, the remnants of the portal blending with a peculiar black substance, launching into the assembly hall like deadly projectiles. The cultists closest to the blast were instantaneously vaporized. They've breached the portal. Unthinkable. They've been repelled for generations, how could spectral warriors break their own cycle? At the heart of the sludge pool, the blonde cultist leader whirled his gaze in disbelief towards the origin of the explosion. However, before he could distinguish the figures surging through the remnants of the shattered portal, a towering pillar of green fire exploded into his peripheral vision. His attention snapped back, only to witness the sacrificial offering, destined for the Nether Lord, now enshrined in flames, radiating brilliantly in the mesmerizing tableau of spectral fire. The instant the colossal portal within the congregation was shattered, Agatha had managed to extricate herself from the shackles of the sacrificial ritual. Capitalizing on this transient window of opportunity, she had kindled the emerald fire, using her own spirit as the catalyst. A spiritual conflagration erupted. In the unexpected panorama, awash in the ethereal glow of green flames, Agatha spotted a massive breach in the wall opposite the sludge pool. A squadron bearing a striking resemblance to sailors, alight with the same emerald flames, stormed into the hall. The flames enveloped them, and the spark ignited within her resonated with an intense harmony. A grin spread across Agatha's face as clarity draped over her and comprehension flourished. Amidst the cavorting flames, she slowly extended her hands, lifting them in a gesture of welcome. The beacon has been kindled. Lost and disoriented, a figure of ill-defined shape maneuvered through the narrow, needle-like gaps amid a labyrinth of thorns, intermittently illuminated by thin rays of light. Its resolve seemed to be caught in a tremulous dance, daring to stretch across the insurmountable chasm of madness and foolishness. How long had she wandered this realm seething with tumultuous chaos? How much exposure had she suffered from the unholy corruption of the primordial deity? Was she still intact, a coherent entity, or merely a shattered remnant teetering on the verge of being devoured and subsumed into this anarchy? Agatha found herself adrift in a sea of indistinctness, unable to distinguish anything, even the borders that separated her physicality from the enveloping pandemonium. To her, her form appeared akin to a splotch of ink gradually spreading in water, the outlines exhibiting a blurry, liquid-soaked texture. It felt less as if she was advancing step by step through this oppressive darkness, and more like she was drifting forward, immersed in a dense medium echoing her own corporeal substance. She sensed everything was pushing towards a certain limit. The elementary particles of life, she couldn't affirm their role in the creation of all existence, but it was clear they had molded her present form. Ice melts into water and dissipates into the air. The replica crafted from these foundational elements was fated to return to the metaphoric ocean, represented by these elements. The so-called individual will, housed within this form, was bound to transform into an inconsequential pinpoint of light in this chaotic ocean, serving as sustenance for other glimmering specks aimlessly wandering amidst the bramble of thorns. She was simply a facsimile, a phantom. She held memories spanning a 24-year life, memories of her birthplace, her comrades, and everything she cherished and loathed. Yet, what truly belonged to her in those 24 years of life could perhaps be distilled down to a mere 3 days or even less. For reasons unknown, Governor Winston's voice resonated abruptly within her consciousness, laden with tones of resignation and sorrow. There's no meaning. A being of authentic existence inscribed such a statement on their existence within this boundless darkness. In contrast, a mere imitation possessing only 3 days of existence dared to traverse the darkness, aiming to confront the ancient god. How absurd, Agatha murmured softly, her voice dissolving into the darkness, transforming into a subtle ripple. Concurrently, a relentless stream of data flooded her consciousness, a mysterious will constituted by binary, 0, and 1, inundating her psyche. She was acutely aware she stood at the brink of dissolving into this expansive consciousness. Even if this space contained the ancient gods, transient thoughts, in a fleeting instant, its colossal magnitude was far beyond what her fragile psyche could withstand. Yet, that was all right. She had made it. She had journeyed through the enormous thorny wilderness and had reached the innermost depths of the darkness. A vast tentacle, akin to a towering pillar supporting the sky, stood imposingly before her. The surface of the pillar, intricately embellished with enigmatic, dark blue lines, seemed to serve as a monument etching the testament of ancient truths against the gloomy canvas of chaos. Agatha slowly lifted her gaze and reached out, seeking to make contact with it while particles of black fragments and dust twirled and hovered within her sight. Her skin, a canvas mapped with a multitude of wounds, bore the evidence of a grueling passage through a merciless thicket. A black substance, unsettlingly similar to sludge, seeped from her, rising like a spectral mist, diffusing, and eventually dissolving into the surrounding emptiness. The floating fragments and dust of ebony were nothing more than remnants emanating from her essence. In this instant, Agatha felt as though she were a hideous puppet, marred by a network of cracks, a sight so horrifying that even an ocean's worth of bandages would fall short in offering any semblance of concealment. Comparatively, the primordial god's tentacle remained unaffected, wholly indifferent to her touch. It neither emitted any formidable energy nor exhibited any intimidating traits. It failed to even respond to her daring provocation. The only sensation her fingertips registered was a subtly cool, soft, slightly rugged touch. Was this indifference because the tentacle was merely an echo from the unfathomable abyss of the ocean? Or was her existence too insignificant to draw the attention of the ancient god? Agatha furrowed her brow, pondering over what she could accomplish in these final fleeting moments. Yet, after a prolonged period of contemplation, she realized she was devoid of any tangible goal. She had arrived at her destination, unraveled the enigma of this darkness, journeyed through the spiky labyrinth representing the ancient deity's thoughts, and caught a glimpse of the true essence of the profound God hidden in the core of this darkness. She even had the audacity to touch the god's tentacle with her own bare hands. There was no more truth to discover, no remaining objectives to pursue. This final journey seemed less about performing the duty of a gatekeeper and more about satisfying her own stubborn resolve. Now, it was time to rest. So, Agatha sighed softly, allowing her body to yield. She pivoted slowly, leaning against the gigantic tentacle as one might find solace against a robust pillar. I likely won't have a soul to accompany me, Agatha pondered aloud in the darkness as a peculiar thought abruptly materialized in her mind. She swiftly dismissed it with a light-hearted chuckle, shaking her head, of course not. If I truly had a soul, crossing that boundary would definitely wreak havoc for the gatekeeper on the other side, and what would happen to her if I crossed? You can't cross that threshold twice. I wonder what's happening at the cathedral. Did those who ventured into the well make their return? They probably don't need to worry. In the shrouding darkness, she found herself immersed in a stream of contemplative dialogue, as if unable to stem the flow of her musings, unintentionally vocalizing her innermost thoughts. However, her introspection was abruptly cut short by a foreign sensation, a sudden surge of blistering heat that jolted Agatha out of her thoughtful reverie. It felt as though she was swallowed by a formidable inferno, threatening to annihilate her very soul. Her thoughts, poised on the precipice of merging into this chaos, were abruptly rekindled. She squirmed within the illusion of being consumed by flames, oblivious to the unfolding sequence of events. Yet, in the subsequent moment, a familiar voice echoed within her mind, "The beacon has been lit." It was her own voice. Agatha's eyes sprang open in the consuming darkness, as a piercing green light streaked across her vision, blurring the boundary between illusion and reality. A vision unfolded before her. She saw herself teetering on the precipice of a boundless abyss, simmering with a menacing black sludge and surrounded by monstrous minions and demonic entities. Within this flame-engulfed corridor, a revelation struck her. She became cognizant of another consciousness, another self. The other, her, acknowledged her presence too. She now comprehended what was expected of her. There remained a task that beckoned her attention. Agatha pivoted sharply, her gaze transfixed on the enormous tentacle that stood before her like a monumental pillar. A radiant smile bloomed across her face, the most resplendent one she had mustered since her arrival in this darkness, and a blazing light reignited from the depths of her eyes. Taking a decisive step forward, she extended both hands towards the tentacle. The flames swiftly enveloped her entire form, but the scorching torment felt more akin to a revered tribute than agony. She flung her arms wide open in a gesture that seemed more like an embrace than a lunging attack. Boom! A terrifying roar echoed through the darkness as the two forces clashed, the flames engulfing the distorted space in a split second. Amidst the escalating symphony of the spiritual fire, the colossal tentacle instantaneously transformed into a blazing beacon, trembling violently within the conflagration. Agatha felt her flesh rapidly decomposing in the fiery blaze. Her body, originally fashioned from corrupt substances, was now part of the purifying process that the fire orchestrated. But she harbored no fear. Instead, she strained to lift her head, casting a backward glance towards the path from which she had arrived. The thorny wilderness was also ablaze. Amidst the swiftly spreading spiritual fire, it took on an uncanny, yet entrancing, likeness to a fiery tree crown. Farewell, Governor Winston. Agatha murmured to herself, tightening her grip on the tentacle within the fire, serenely awaiting the final chapter of her existence. Yet, as her consciousness teetered on the edge of extinction, she suddenly registered an anomaly. The fire had consumed both her and the tentacle. For the first time, within the passage sculpted by the spiritual fire, she felt a reaction from this ancient god's extension. In surprise, she lifted her gaze, studying the intricate designs on the tentacle's surface, observing the flames as they danced upon it, and sensing the deluge of information rushing into her mind from the spiritual fire. It was as though countless eyes had opened on the tentacle's surface, each urgently imparting pieces of knowledge and information. Ultimately, the entire spectrum of knowledge and information coalesced into a whirlpool in her mind. 11,101,001, 11100101, 10001000, 10,010,011. Endless chains of 0 and 1 seized the remnants of Agatha's consciousness. But this time, she managed to decipher their cryptic narrative. Error, clone. In a state of astonished disbelief, she pieced together the enigmatic message relayed by the ancient god's extension, fathoming its intentions and subsequently unraveling an astonishing revelation. With her gaze fixed on the tentacle she had set aflame, she wondered, could this be merely another illusion? In the following moment, the lingering spark of her consciousness was devoured by the relentless, emerald conflagration. The sacred ritual was irreparably broken apart. The inciting incidents were numerous and catastrophic. The Queen's Guard, caught in a 50-year-long cycle, disrupted their perennial rhythm, causing a ripple effect throughout the holy proceedings. Trespassers, against all odds, broke through the sacred Gate of Ascension, a pivotal landmark within the ceremonial chamber. A surge of unknown beings brazenly invaded the sacred grounds, adding to the pandemonium. Most shockingly, the chosen sacrifice gave herself up voluntarily to the emerald flames in the heart of the elemental pool. This sequence of events cast the highly venerated and final ceremonial rites into an inescapable chaos. Sanctity was breached as heretics rampaged through the sanctuary, brutally massacring the devout followers of the Nether Lord, thus reducing years of faithful service to ruin. What devastation have you wrought? In the center of the deep pool, the cult leader, appearing as a young man with golden locks, bellowed in anger. His body began to expand rapidly, supported by the black, viscous substance surrounding him, contorting into a monstrous, oversized beast. His arm shot out towards Agatha, and from the pool, a barrage of sharp thorns and bony spikes violently sprang forth, aimed at the gatekeeper who dared to stand resolute amid the burning flames. However, all aggressive attempts disintegrated into ashes before they could even touch Agatha, burnt to oblivion by the spectral green flames. In counterattack, these otherworldly flames followed the ashes trail, steadily devouring the sacrificial symbols and blasphemous artifacts bordering the pool, eventually invading the pool itself. Enshrouded in an emerald green aura, Agatha turned into a beacon for the spectral fire, which blazed out from her with a passionate intensity. Each of her wounds transformed into a channel, acting as conduits for the foreign energy. The torment of being engulfed by the flames had, at some point, subsided, and she burst into laughter in the heart of the conflagration, staring back defiantly at the enraged yet powerless heretic, whispering to herself, "Ah, I understand now." In the blink of an eye, her eyes were overtaken by the ghost fire, with flames spouting from the empty sockets. Utilizing these scorched out eyes, she surveyed her surroundings, observing the cultists, who were entangled in a chaotic dance around the dark pool. As her gaze passed over them, every cultist was set aflame. The demons intertwined with them too ignited, all the blasphemous artifacts in the chamber provided fuel to the flames, and even the hall itself took on the appearance of a blazing inferno. She had been gifted power by the flame usurper, and she used this pyrokinetic strength to obliterate the sacrilegious actions taking place here. This was the revelation that dawned upon her the moment her eyes were consumed by the fire. The heretical figure engulfed in the heart of the sludge was of no consequence. He was nothing more than a grotesque being who had undergone a self-destructive metamorphosis. The true substance of this place was the circle of grotesque, deformed heretics who were screaming in high, shrieking tones around the muddied pool. Stop. Desist immediately. You're oblivious to the ramifications of your actions. A ceremony run amok spells disaster for everyone. It has already morphed into. The cult leader, now transformed into a bloated monstrosity, cried out in desperation, desperately erecting barriers in a vain effort to stem the spread of the rampant flames consuming the hall. But in the midst of his plea, a gunshot reverberated from the side, effectively silencing his outcry. Bang! A young soldier, dressed in the uniform harkening back to a bygone era and clutching an old-fashioned rifle, charged into the hall, his weapon targeted at the distorted, inflated behemoth nestled in the core of the murky pool. Swiftly, the brave fighter was swallowed by the whirling black sludge, but hot on his heels, a new wave of soldiers burst into the hall. At this point, the timeline had crossed the counterattack phase attributed to the Queen's Guard. These ghostly soldiers were expected to dissolve into non-existence, yet it was clear that this cycle had been distorted due to the destruction of the Thorn Gate. The Queen's Guard, which should have disappeared at the next pivotal point, were now deviated from their cycle and launched their offensive on the final sanctuary. The regiment led by Lawrence found themselves entwined in battles with nearby cultists and enigmatic demons. Their ammo had run out, yet they still wielded sharp sabers and swords, and bodies momentarily unmarked by death. So even when confronted with dark priests and demonic beings possessing a myriad of dangerous powers, they stood their ground like indomitable supernatural beings. With a loud clang, Lawrence's short sword split a bone spike hurtling towards him. He skillfully evaded a fireball on the verge of explosion. Advancing amid the flames, he severed the chain attached to a cultist's neck, watching as the body of this dark priest rapidly crumbled into ashes. He then raised his eyes, fixating on the long-haired woman standing sentinel in front of the mud pool, alight like a flaming beacon. "Miss, we're here to support you." The battle-hardened captain roared. "We're all under captain's command, aren't we? Which ship are you serving on?" He recognized without a doubt that the young woman enwrapped in the flames was ignited by the same spectral green fire as him, confirming unmistakably that she was one of their own. However, the flames enveloping her were darker in color and noticeably more expansive than his, indicating she was not just any one of them. Relying on his abundant experience as an adventurer and a captain, Captain Lawrence quickly took stock of the situation, deciding it was in his best interest to amiably address a high-ranking comrade who was destined to accompany them on their future voyage. Agatha turned, surprised, to the robust old man, who bore a striking resemblance to a sea captain, shouting at her from a distance. "What did you say?" After a moment of confusion, she found herself unable to suppress the urge to respond, shouting back, "There's too much commotion here, I can't make out your words." Taken aback, Lawrence pivoted towards his comrades, raising a query. She answered, "Didn't she I'm not sure. Anomaly 077, who happened to be the closest, was currently bellowing. His voice was fraught with panic and terror as he zigzagged around the rapidly expanding flames, artfully evading bullets, fireballs, bone spikes, and even dismembered limbs flying through the air. His dual blades had already suffered nicks. I'm a sailor. Why am I embroiled in a battle against a horde of cultists in a sewer now? This is a task suited for ground forces. You didn't complain when we disembarked, Lawrence retorted with a booming voice. You were ebullient, like a pirate on the verge of pillaging a city-state. Consider yourself an infantryman then. You son of a. What was that? You, damned. In a daze, Agatha observed the amusing quarrel that was taking place between the burly, rugged sailors and their captain. She looked around at the chaos unfolding around her, feeling perplexed by the spectacle. Who were these people? Where had they come from? What was their objective? She noticed unfamiliar faces, all enshrouded in the same emerald fire that engulfed her, engaged in a fierce battle with the heretics in the hall. At the same time, a squad of soldiers, spectral remnants from a past era, stormed into the chaos, their rifles spewing bullets indiscriminately. Among their battle cries, the name of the Frost Queen would occasionally resound. The whole situation was inexplicable, as though, following her decision to sacrifice herself, the entire narrative of the world had undergone a bizarre twist. However, her rampant thoughts were suddenly brought to a halt by the escalating roar of the wind resonating in her ears. The bloated, grotesque giant leaned in her direction. All of you, unforgivable. It growled, its form spraying a chaotic gush of filth-laden, inky sludge. The formerly handsome, blonde young man had been completely replaced by a monstrous being maintaining a vague human form. A ghastly array of interlacing mouths covered its body, the friction and whispers between the sharp teeth eliciting an intense dread. As Agatha watched, its skull slowly cracked open to reveal menacing eyes. The primordial substance had entirely devoured and substituted this monster's previous human form. It had become one with the mud pool, even, integrated with a larger, more chaotic entity. The inflated abomination peered at Agatha through its multitude of eyes. The spreading sludge around it ignited, the flames even lapping at its form. However, the monster seemed immune to the pain, simply chanting in a monotonous tone, "Unstoppable, unstoppable, error, error." Your plot has already crumbled, Agatha rebutted, her gaze unflinchingly fixed on the monstrous entity before her. The flames leaking from her hollowed-out eye sockets caused the air around her to waver. Surely, you must sense that the supposed channel has been disrupted. The counterphase process between the mirror and reality has come to a halt. Stopped. For a fleeting moment, the monster appeared momentarily lucid at Agatha's assertion. A flicker of human-like resentment emerged within the multitude of its deformed eyes. Innocent, do you believe your self-sacrifice leaves us bereft of alternatives? A spark of confusion briefly passed through Agatha. In the next instant, she witnessed the giant abruptly lift its hands. The extremities began a dramatic metamorphosis, expanding and splitting into what looked like dried, fissured branches, which then transformed into vast clusters of thorn-like formations. They pierced through the ceiling of the grand hall and all surrounding pipes. Within this thorny proliferation, elusive sparks of light flitted about, reminiscent of a swarm of fireflies. From the heart of this thorn bush, ecstatic exclamations reverberated. Ah, I see it. I comprehend. I have grasped it. What a magnificent scheme. What an expansive blueprint. Oh, the most powerful and sacred master, I discern your intention. I have understood, to reconfigure this world, indeed, to reshape, all of us, and everything in this world, will be reborn from the divine flesh and blood. Disciples, it's time for the sacrifice. Sacrifice. Under the horrified gaze of Agatha and the ground combat unit led by Lawrence, the remaining annihilators in the grand hall began to cheer ecstatically. It was as if they had been graced with some divine epiphany. With this rising chorus of cheer, they started diving headlong, one after another, into the central mud pool of the grand hall. Devotees of the Nether Lord, dedicated followers of a dark force, met their horrific fate in unimaginably gruesome ways. The ritual they had been performing was thrown into chaos, and the remaining members of the cult made a collective, deliberate decision to sacrifice themselves. They did this in an attempt to forcefully achieve the transformation of the Mirror City, a feat that would seemingly defy the natural order of things. Despite a lifetime filled with maritime adventures that brought him face to face with an eclectic variety of extraordinary sights, Lawrence was absolutely dumbfounded and appalled by the terrifying spectacle unfolding before him. This was beyond anything he had ever witnessed or experienced before. Driven by a frenzied madness, hundreds of cult members threw themselves ecstatically into the violently churning pool of mud, their bodies breaking apart and melting away in the mire. Their disturbing display of joy was eerily undiminished by their horrifying demise. Meanwhile, shadowy demons, once bound to the cultists' existence, broke free from their chains of servitude. They exploded around the mud pool, their death throes releasing plumes of corrupted smoke and putrid smells, hindering the progress of the Queen's Guard. In the midst of this chaos, a large crown of thorns rose from the center of the mud pool, rapidly growing to encompass the entire hall within a blink of an eye, fueled by the continuing self-sacrifice of the manic cultists. I have comprehended. A voice, echoing with the intensity of hundreds, boomed from the thorny crown. It was a fevered proclamation, a declaration of understanding that was chilling in its intensity. We have comprehended. The doomed cultists, hurling themselves willingly into the mud pool, repeated the phrase in unison. Their deafening cries echoed along the length of the second waterway, causing it to tremble under the ferocity of their pledge. I will fulfill. We will fulfill. Manifest the Creator's blueprint. Manifest the Creator's blueprint. Boom. Flames erupted suddenly, engulfing the entire hall and the thorny tree crown in their fiery wrath. Lawrence had just enough time to look up and see the crown disintegrate amidst the ghostly flames. The crown transformed into a shower of gray-black dust that rained down until everything was scorched and barren. However, the tremors of the second waterway continued, and the chilling echoes of the cultists' last cries still hung heavily in the air. Their eerie wails lingered like spectral remnants in this underground domain, sending cold shivers down the spine. In a state of stunned disbelief, Lawrence surveyed the chaotic aftermath, his mind clouded with uncertainty. Finally, he verbalized his doubts, almost without realizing it. Did we succeed? The ritual was stopped, right? All the cultists seemed to be dead, and that tree was consumed, Anomaly 077 speculated nervously, casting an anxious glance around the devastated scene, but I have a gut feeling. This isn't over yet. A voice broke through the crackling of the lingering flames, cutting off Lawrence's conversation with the sailor. Lawrence, along with Agatha, swiftly turned their attention to the group of strangers who had joined them in their battle. Agatha remained in her combative stance, flames still licking her form, a stark contrast to the woman she was when she first entered this mirror city. She had changed in ways beyond recognition. Her previously black gown was now a shadow of its former self, having morphed into a ragged cloak. It hung loosely around her body, much like the worn-out attire of an aged priest. Her physical form bore a resemblance to a shattered puppet adorned with brutal injuries and a myriad of deep gashes. Her blood had long since drained from her wounds, replaced by an uncanny green fire that flowed from her injuries, reminiscent of a dreamlike, glowing river. Her eyes had succumbed to the overpowering flames of the usurper, leaving her with nothing but empty sockets. In the hollow voids where her eyes had once resided, two bright flames now danced fervently. While she had lost the vision of her earthly body, she had acquired a profound, supernatural perception. She could sense the lingering energy that coursed through the hall, and the entire mirror city seemed to throb with an unnatural life force. She could perceive an immensely vast structure that permeated the city, serving as its foundation and driving its ascent towards the palpable world. With spectral flames billowing out beneath her feet, causing the floor to sizzle, Agatha took a step forward. She extended her hand, reaching out to grasp a thorn that had sprouted from the mud pool and gently squeezed it. Under her touch, the thorn, desiccated by the ghostly flames, crumbled with ease. However, amid the scattered remnants, tiny specks of light continued to flow unabated. The mirror continues its ascension, she murmured to herself, or possibly to an unseen entity. The heretics have been wiped out, but their legacy lives on. This mirror city continues to exist. It's journeying towards reality autonomously. I'm sorry, but I don't know how to stop it. Intrigued, Lawrence moved closer, scrutinizing Agatha. Who are you talking to? Before he could finish his question, a violent tremor rippled through the ground, followed by a thunderous rumble overhead. Startled, he and the sailors looked up to witness a sight they would never forget. As the hull shook violently, the formidable layers of rock, concrete, steel, and dirt above them suddenly turned translucent. In this sudden clarity, they could see the layers upon layers of structures above. Drainage systems, power pipelines, steam delivery systems, subways, and beyond them, mountains, streets, buildings, churches, all of frost. Through the dense strata, he could see frost as it truly was. He saw a city cloaked in heavy fog, besieged by countless monsters launching relentless attacks from within the shroud. The city guards and defenders were locked in fierce combat with the invading monsters, palpable darkness creeping through the city, and fear spreading in every nook and cranny. "Oh, I reckon we're in a bit of a pickle." Anomaly 077, like everyone else, took a moment to gaze upwards before he muttered, "Or perhaps it's the folks above who are truly in danger." Regaining his composure, Lawrence became acutely aware of the magnitude of the impending disaster. Despite the cultists being eradicated, their final sacrificial ritual had been successful. This mirror city had acquired a life of its own and was continuing its upward trajectory, adhering to some unknown blueprint. If this course were to continue unabated, the real-world city of Frost would undoubtedly crumble. Isn't there any way to stop this? His eyes widened in desperation as he urgently turned towards Agatha. "We're about to converge with the real world." In response, Agatha merely rotated her head and fixed her ablaze eyes on Lawrence. She remained silent, yet a voice of tranquil authority echoed directly within Lawrence's mind. "Maintain your calm. This is but a part of the solution." Surprised momentarily, Lawrence quickly recognized the source of the mental communication. His muscles tensed visibly. Captain. Relax, and prepare for what lies ahead." With a baffled look, Lawrence could only stare. Meanwhile, in the physical world, the relentless roar of cannons reverberated across the boundless sea as the surviving naval forces of Frost and the Mist Fleet valiantly tried to fend off the phantoms that kept emerging from the fog. With time passing, there was no sign of a decrease in the apparition ships surfacing from the fog. In fact, their numbers seemed to be on the rise. Unidentified vessel approaching from the port side. "It's a swift gunboat. Prepare for close quarters defense fire." Frost Navy's escort vessel S-30 has sunk in nearby waters. Remove it from the identification list. Fire on the aft deck. Damage control. Damage control. Commands were being shouted, the thunderous discharge of the primary cannon, explosions, the deafening sound of water crashing against the ship's hull, all merging into a chaotic cacophony, creating an atmosphere of impending doom. Tyrion stood at the helm of the Sea Mist, his hands gripping the railing in front of him, his gaze unwaveringly fixed on the distant sea, his face mirroring the sternness of a gathering storm. The conflict had raged on for a considerable time, but the beacon of victory remained shrouded in the darkness as enemy vessels kept pouring out of the thick fog. The undead sailors knew no fatigue, but the relentless and intense fighting was gradually draining the energy of the Mist Fleet. The Sea Mist's self-repair capability was nearing its limit, struggling even to extinguish the flames engulfing the deck, heavily reliant on the tireless efforts of the damage control crew. The Raven had only just withdrawn from the battle a few minutes ago, now retreating towards Frost with its severely damaged hull. If even an undead vessel was suffering such damage, one could only fathom the dire situation the human-crewed Frost Navy was grappling with. The dire straits in which the Frost Navy found itself were made starkly clear by the constant stream of distress calls coming over the radio. Their resilience was stretched to its limit as damages and personnel losses on each vessel were rapidly approaching critical thresholds. Ironically, the members of the Mist Fleet, who had spent the past 50 years mocking and ridiculing the Navy, now collectively hoped that these human seafarers could hang on a little longer, that they could continue to fight just a bit more. A thunderous detonation echoed from afar, followed by a massive flash that punctuated the fog. An unyielding blaze ensued, accompanied by a series of secondary explosions. Tyrion instinctively turned his gaze toward the commotion, instructing the communication officer to quickly ascertain the cause of the blasts. In the ensuing chaos, First Officer Aiden emerged with grim news. The flagship of the Frost Navy, Lord Brooke, has suffered critical damage to its steam core. The reactor has detonated, and the vessel is sinking, he reported. Tyrion offered no immediate reply, merely closing his eyes in a moment of silent tribute. Having crossed paths with that ship many times over the last 2 years, he was well acquainted with its commander, a true frostman, a man of commendable character, commanding a formidable vessel. Now, all that was lost to the cold depths of the sea forever. Log the incident. Perhaps there will be a time in the future to honor the fallen, Tyrion finally spoke, reopening his eyes as his head gently swayed. Our current situation, however, doesn't allow for such sentiment. His words were abruptly cut short by an unexpected shift in the scene outside the porthole. His gaze, filled with surprised curiosity, was drawn to the view. The first officer, along with several others on the bridge, instinctively followed his stare. The maritime fog was receding.